In 1953, the fight in Vietnam was heating up. Ho Chi Minh's communists were like shadows, hiding in the jungles, waiting for the right moment to strike. The French, on the other hand, were determined to bring these rebels into the daylight and end the resistance. The battles were constant, but neither side gained a clear advantage. The Vietnamese had their ambush tactics, while the French relied on their artillery and air support. It was a dangerous game, where every move could mean life or death. General Henri Navarre was sent to turn the tide. He knew he needed victories to gain ground in peace negotiations. But his troops were scattered across the country, protecting remote outposts and leaving gaps in their defense. Determined to change the course of the war, Navarre made a risky decision. He ordered the abandonment of several outposts, including Nha San, concentrating his forces in the Red River Delta. It was a high-stakes gamble, leaving areas unprotected to reinforce his position in the heart of the conflict. As the troops moved and plans were laid out, suspense hung in the air. Everyone knew that a final battle was approaching, a battle that could change the course of the war once and for all. In Vietnam, the fight spreads like wildfire in dry fields. Commandos cut through the jungle, eliminating pockets of Vietnamese resistance, while in other areas, the focus is on training locals to defend their lands. It's a dangerous dance, where every step can mean the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, in the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, an old war hero, is now in command. He looks beyond the oceans, concerned about the claws of communism reaching across Europe and now threatening Asia. The recently concluded Korean War leaves a bitter taste of stalemate and division, showing the power of international forces, but also the terrible price they pay without a clear victory. The view on Ho Chi Minh also changes drastically. Once seen as a hero fighting against French colonialism, he is now painted as a puppet in the hands of Soviet communism. The United States agrees to help with a hefty sum of money, but with heavy conditions. France must abandon any attempt to negotiate with Ho Chi Minh and support the remilitarization of West Germany in Europe. As money changes hands and policies adjust, the shadows of war lengthen over Laos. The Viet Minh moves, extending its tentacles, forcing France into an inevitable response. Suspense grows as the players prepare for the next move, knowing that each decision could lead to a point of no return. Navarre's decision had the air of a final gamble. Cutting off the supply routes of the Viet Minh was a risky move, but he was determined to turn the tide. Dien Bien Phu, a seemingly insignificant village, became the epicenter of the French strategy. In a bold stroke, French paratroopers descended from the skies on November 20, 1953. But what they expected to be a smooth landing turned into a nightmare. The Vietnamese were waiting, and the sky filled with lead as soon as the soldiers began to descend. Major Bigard recalled the chaos. "We thought we would be alone, but the Vietnamese were there, ready to greet us with fire and death." With the area finally secure, the French began to fortify Dien Bien Phu. Tractors roared, erecting barricades as men worked under the watchful eye of the enemy. The plan was clear: to turn the village into a fortress, a base from which to launch attacks and patrols against the Viet Minh. In the months that followed, Dien Bien Phu was transformed. 9 defensive strongholds sprouted from the ground, protecting the vital landing strips at the bottom of the valley. But the surrounding hills were also occupied, each mound a lookout post against the invisible enemy in the jungles. Suspense hung in the air. Dien Bien Phu was ready for what was to come, a battle that would decide the fate of entire nations. The French were prepared to fight to the last man, but the Viet Minh would not retreat either. The valley became a boiling cauldron, where the fate of thousands would be sealed with the blood spilled on the earth. The French movement was frenetic. Troops arrived in caravans, bringing with them the weight of war.
Disassembled tanks, planes roaring in the skies, and even women brought to an improvised brothel at the base, everything blended into a frenzy of activity. The numbers were impressive. Over 10,000 men gathered, a mix of colonial soldiers, Vietnamese, and foreigners. They prepared for a battle that could change the course of history. Colonel Pyroth, confident in his weapons, declared that nothing would pass through his defenses. But the Viet Minh was not foolish. They saw the flaws in the fortress of Dien Bien Phu, each gap an opportunity. The distance from Hanoi, the lack of supplies, the improvised defenses, all of this was like a clear picture for the enemy. As the French braced for the worst, suspense hung over the valley. Each day brought the promise of imminent battle, of a confrontation that would decide the fate of thousands. And amid the turmoil of war, the pieces were moving on the board, each move a gamble in the fight for survival. The concentration of forces was like a high-stakes bet at a gambling table. Giap knew that every resource sent to Dien Bien Phu was a card drawn from elsewhere, an opportunity for the Viet Minh. But he cared not for the losses, for he saw beyond. Whoever mastered the valley would have the advantage in negotiations. The roar of cannons echoed through the mountains, signaling the beginning of a deadly dance. The Vietnamese adjusted their weapons, each shot a step closer to victory. Meanwhile, the French braced for the impending attack, aware they were about to face a storm. The atmosphere was tense, laden with the weight of destiny. The soldiers knew what was to come, and uncertainty hung over them like a shadow. A legionnaire shared his words. "They hit us like an avalanche, an unstoppable force of nature. Our defenses fell like dominoes, burying men and hope under a hail of projectiles. Every bunker, every trench, was a point of resistance against the relentless tide. But the Viet Minh's strength was like a hammer, crushing everything in its path. The battle was a symphony of destruction, a duel between titans whose outcome would be etched in the pages of history. The movement of troops and weaponry was like a high-stakes gamble for Giap, a calculated risk that could tip the French defenses in other areas. But he had an eye on negotiations, knowing that whoever triumphed at Dien Bien Phu would have a crucial diplomatic advantage. The thunder of cannons echoed through the valley on January 31, 1954, marking the beginning of a 6-week war. Vietnamese gunners adjusted their pieces, observing enemy fire, while the French nervously awaited the imminent attack. Tension mounted with each passing day. French soldiers shared their concerns, likening the impending battle to great conflicts of the past. But nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. On March 11th, the first blows from the Viet Minh struck the northern bastions, including the isolated position of Beatrice. The Vietnamese demonstrated deadly accuracy, bombarding French defenses before launching their assaults. A legionnaire described the hell that ensued. It was as if the sky itself was falling upon us, projectiles raining down like hail in a night of terror. Bunker after bunker, trench after trench, everything crumbled under the enemy's might. The battle grew ever fiercer, a fight for survival amid the chaos of war. Chaos spread like wildfire in dry straw. Viet Minh attacks severed the French supply lines, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. Beatrice fell on March 14th, a devastating blow that left 3/4 of the French troops casualties. As the Vietnamese advanced, Gabriel was in Giap's crosshairs. Not even an armored counterattack could halt the enemy's advance. The French artillery fire was like a breeze against the Vietnamese onslaught, futile in the face of the enemy's overwhelming strength. Meanwhile, French resupply efforts were met with a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. The vital C-47s for resupply were destroyed on the ground, with only 2 Bearcats narrowly escaping. At the height of despair, Colonel Pyroth chose the only path left to him, taking his own life. For many, the battle was already lost, but the remaining French soldiers did not give up. Reinforcements were parachuted in, even if some lacked parachuting experience. Among the reinforcements, a nurse, Genevieve de Gallard, stood out. She remained at the base to care for the wounded, her bravery earning her the prestigious Légion d'honneur. As the siege intensified, each new day brought the horror of war. But even in the midst of darkness, a glimpse of heroism emerged, a ray of hope amidst the storm of violence.
The situation was critical, and French leaders were pressed to find a way out of the looming disaster. 3 options were on the table, each riskier than the other. Operation Condor proposed a bold march towards Dien Bien Phu, while Operation Albatross considered a retreat to French positions. But it was Operation Vulture that caught the eye, a desperate plea to the United States for more military support. Despite doubts, the French chose to pursue both Condor and Vulture, keeping Albatross as a last resort. But soon they faced a challenge. Gathering the troops and transport needed for Condor was a monumental task. Navarre then pinned his hopes on Vulture. He requested heavy B-29 bombers from the U.S., capable of dealing a devastating blow to Viet Minh positions. But there was a problem. Training French crews to pilot these aircraft was a dubious undertaking. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, in Washington, the debate was raging. Some, like Secretary of State John Dulles and Vice President Richard Nixon, supported direct military intervention, even the use of nuclear weapons. But others were not so inclined to risk it all. Tension was mounting, the decision hanging by a thin thread. And amid the shadows of uncertainty, the fate of thousands was about to be sealed by a single move on the political and military chessboard.
The shadow of war loomed over the corridors of power as the United States grappled with the dilemma of intervention in Indochina. With military costs already weighing heavily on American shoulders, General Ridgway's suggestion echoed like a grim warning. Lyndon B. Johnson, echoing the concerns, insisted that any action should be part of an international coalition. Eisenhower, in an urgent letter to Churchill, sought to rally forces against a growing threat, but his words found a cold reception in Britain, where the preference was for a negotiated settlement. The hope of a united front faded, leaving the United States in a delicate position. Yet, a shadow of intervention hung over Dien Bien Phu. While officially maintaining a distance, 37 American pilots, secretly employed by the CIA, carried out resupply missions for the besieged base. Some saw Eisenhower's proposal as an attempt to balance the fine line between supporting France and the desire to avoid direct conflict. For him, unilateral intervention would pose an unsustainable burden, a risk that could weaken the United States' defensive position. As debates raged on in the halls of power, in the shadows of war, every move was calculated, every word heavy with the weight of destiny. And on the dark horizon of geopolitics, the future of Indochina remained uncertain, a question mark that only time could reveal. The scene in Dien Bien Phu was bleak, with French defenders cornered on the edge of the abyss. The Vietnamese had seized much of the northern camp and nearly disabled the crucial airfield. Without support from the United States, a relief column was being prepared in Laos, but the inclement weather and Viet Minh activity threatened its viability. Meanwhile, French air support proved powerless against Vietnamese determination. With Dien Bien Phu's own planes destroyed, the French had to rely on assistance from the Red River Delta. However, heavy anti-aircraft fire limited their attack options, while napalm supplies dwindled. Faced with a relentless Viet Minh offensive, the French resorted to a desperate weapon, lazy dog fragmentation bombs. With their 11,200 sharp and deadly arrows, they became a final desperate attempt to halt the enemy advance in the dense jungle. On March 30th, the battle reached its climax with the fierce struggle for the Five Hills. Despite some isolated successes with anti-aircraft guns, the French saw their positions at Dominique and Elaine gradually lost amid intense fighting. French counterattacks, though courageous, only further weakened their already debilitated forces. With increasing casualties among the legionnaires and paratroopers, defense increasingly fell to Vietnamese, Algerian, and Moroccan auxiliary units allied with France. Hope seemed to slip through their fingers as the siege closed relentlessly around Dien Bien Phu.
Amidst the turmoil of combat, while the East seethed with action, Vietnam ruthlessly advanced against the French headquarters in the west, directing its fury towards the bastions François and Huguet. The fight was savage, each clash leaving deep scars on both sides of the conflict. Giap, the Vietnamese leader, acknowledged the harshness of the battle for Huguet, a trial by fire for his fighters. As fatigue spread and anxiety grew among the soldiers, Giap sought siege strategies to undermine the French headquarters' defenses. Chinese engineers disembarked to bolster Vietnamese ranks, digging winding tunnels and trenches around French positions, tightening the noose around the besieged. Since mid-April, the French found themselves cornered in an increasingly shrinking space, while supplies dangerously dwindled. Desperate attempts to airdrop supplies were often thwarted by Vietnam, worsening the defenders' desperate situation. To make matters even more grim, treacherous ambushes and the torrential rains of the monsoon complicated rescue efforts, casting a shadow of discouragement over any hope of relief for the besieged. In early May, the French faced incessant artillery bombardment, trapped in waterlogged trenches, as the war reached a new level of intensity. In the final moments of the brutal assaults, a new threat emerged on the battlefield. Chinese rocket launchers, powerful weapons that evoked memories of the formidable German Nebelwerfer from World War II. Amidst the chaos and impending destruction, the fate of Dien Bien Phu seemed sealed, surrounded by a veil of uncertainty and despair. Vietnam intensifies final bombardments against the French headquarters positions, hitting directly on May 7th. At 6 p.m., the main camp falls under enemy control. Now, only the isolated French bastion of Isabelle remains standing, bravely resisting Vietnam's relentless onslaught. With defense proving futile against the enemy's overwhelming advance, the French find themselves trapped in a true hell. Commenting on the situation, one of the defenders describes the place as a hell in a very small spot. Faced with this bleak scenario, the French make the decision to attempt one last breakout to the south in multiple directions. Most French soldiers are either decimated or captured, with only 78 managing to escape Dien Bien Phu's clutches. As France celebrates the 9th anniversary of the Allied victory over Germany on May 8th, relief units confirm the fortress's fall with a code word, Austerlitz. The outcome of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu is a devastating blow to French colonial authorities. The numbers of dead, wounded, and captured are devastating for the French, with 2,300 soldiers killed, 6,400 wounded, and 9,000 captured. While Vietnamese casualties, which may reach 30,000, do not diminish the significance of the victory for the Viet Minh, it marks a significant milestone on the eve of negotiations. The outcome of Dien Bien Phu is a turning point for French willingness to continue the fight in Indochina. The war is no longer just unpopular, but also seen as irrelevant to many in metropolitan France. Casualty figures reveal the devastating human cost of the conflict, with nearly 79,000 soldiers of the French Union losing their lives, including 15,000 North Africans. The Geneva Accords, signed in July 1954, mark the official end of the conflict. Laos and Cambodia gain their independence, while Vietnam is divided along the 17th parallel, with a communist state to the north and a non-communist state to the south. Although the agreement brings apparent stability, for Ho Chi Minh and his followers, the country's division is a bitter defeat in their quest for a unified Vietnamese nation.
China's ambitions to secure a safe border and prevent U.S. military intervention have been successfully achieved. However, the prospect of a unified and powerful communist Vietnam raises concerns for Chinese regional interests, given the historical tensions between the two countries. China is now pursuing a peace offensive strategy to consolidate its legitimacy and strengthen its diplomatic and strategic gains in the coming years. Meanwhile, for Le Duan, leader of North Vietnam, the reality is painful, facing challenges in reconciling expectations with the harsh reality in the South. For the U.S., the rise of a communist state in northern Vietnam is alarming, raising concerns about the spread of communism in the region. Eisenhower expresses fears that other Asian states may follow suit, triggering what he describes as a series of falling dominoes toward communism. With the French out of the picture, the United States begins to consider measures to protect South Vietnam from communist influence from the north. Meanwhile, the Cold War continues to shape global policies, with the nuclear arms race between superpowers remaining high and the Soviet Union advancing its ambitious atomic communism program. With the deafening sound of gunfire echoing all around, French soldiers responded to the war cry with determination. Men ran back and forth, positioning themselves strategically, while others prepared weapons and checked ammunition. The moment of truth had arrived. Trenches were filled with tension and anticipation, every soldier aware that the fate of Dien Bien Phu hung by a thread. It was a battle for survival, for honor, and for duty. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the roar of approaching Vietnamese tank engines. The ground trembled beneath their heavy footsteps, and the hearts of French soldiers beat as one, preparing for the imminent clash. And then, like thunder reverberating through the skies, combat erupted. Explosions illuminated the darkness of the night, while artillery shots and machine guns pierced the air. The battle unfolded in a chaotic dance of fire and fury, with each side fighting with all their might. The cries of the wounded mingled with the clamor of battle as French soldiers defended their positions bravely. But the enemy showed no mercy, advancing relentlessly towards French defenses, determined to conquer Dien Bien Phu. As the conflict escalated, the fate of the battle remained uncertain. It was a fight for life or death, a battle whose outcome would shape the course of history. And in the heat of battle, the destinies of thousands of men hung in the balance, waiting to be decided by the outcome of this epic struggle for survival. And so, as the Battle of Dien Bien Phu reached its climax, each soldier fought not only for their own life but for the future of their nation and the legacy of their courage. The fires of war burned intensely, illuminating the night with their fury and determination. As the fighting unfolded and the fate of the battle neared its conclusion, the soldiers stood firm, resisting against all odds. The scene was one of heroism, sacrifice, and camaraderie, a true demonstration of the human spirit in the face of adversity. And so, as the dust of battle settled and the sun rose over the battlefield, the survivors could look back with pride on their bravery and determination. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu may have come to an end, but its legacy would live on forever in the memory of those who witnessed it. If you enjoyed this epic content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to General Jack's channel to not miss any future content. Until the next battle, soldiers.